Welcome to Duncan Thorin Shield's YouTube channel. I managed to con Duncan into convincing his friend to pay me thousands of dollars as a professional Counter-Strike player, so maybe he can convince you that some of his analysis is correct.
The Titans, the team who were arguably the team of 2004 and introduced the world to the fabulous, prodigious talent of Wimp, who now obviously works with North in CSGO and later on would go on to play a key role in MTW, the best team of 2008. They're a team who, despite the fact I've just told you, they were arguably the best team over 2004 on aggregate. They won a major. They were a team that really teased the CS community and suggested so much more, promised something special, but didn't do much beyond that year, basically. Now, the context of the Titans coming around and why they were significant is that Denmark had always had a history of good to very good teams in Counter-Strike. They were always known for tactical play, actually having a playbook. They had a deep scene in terms of teams and talent, and they had a good LAN scene there, and they were able to attend the early CPLs and LANs and had some very basic sponsorships in an era where very few teams actually had proper sponsorships. But Denmark was always behind Sweden as a gaming nation. Sweden was obviously the best due to not winning the titles. They would often have top placing, second, third, top 8, but they didn't win the big titles. They also, if you're looking at the Scandinavian or the Nordic region, didn't have the same star power as Norway, for example, who obviously had names like Executor, Element, world champions in their own rights, admittedly mainly playing in Swedish teams, but titanic names in the scene. Now, admittedly, Denmark overall as a country outperformed Norway, and they certainly outperformed Finland, who in the Nordic region was lagging behind generally. But even then, Finns at least had that like punching power of aggressive rush-style Counter-Strike. And so, you know what, Clancy had won the first CPL Europe. Exousia, formerly Apostrophe, famously won Clan-Base Euro Cup Season 3. So 2004, the year when the Titans really came into their own, was a very strange year because this really was like when the balance of power in world global Counter-Strike was restarting to shift from established names who routinely finished at the top of the majors to those teams starting to fall off that initial hegemony of the first few years and newer teams with new cores rising up to take their place or compete and battle with them. So in North America, whereas it had been the likes of Team 3D, also the United 5 squad that had been on top in 2003. Now you got Complexity towards the end of the year rose up with Fraud and Storm, and you had Gamerco become a team that in the CPLs was having top placings, outplacing a number of the teams I mentioned before. In Europe, the best teams from Sweden, SK Gaming of Heaton and Potty, Adrenaline of Westerlund, Executor, these teams started to fall away. While Eyeballers, who'd been one of the best teams at the end of 2003, rose up to take the mantle from SK at the middle of the year. Not NOA, who'd made the big roster move and got an element, managed to make good on the promise of their talent and by the end of the year figure it out to win the last major of the year. So in this sea change of the entire scene really having all these ups and downs and rising and falling stocks, along came the Titans, quite frankly, out of nowhere, because the squad, in terms of its basic core, had existed in 2003. They'd even gone to ESWC, but they'd made no kind of performance of note. They hadn't been able to use someone like Wimp. He'd been too young, and the lineup really hadn't figured itself out. It wasn't even necessarily the best lineup in Denmark, quite frankly. It was surprised they even went to that ESWC. But in 2004, a time where, again, established players and teams, including in the Danish scene, were starting to fall away. So previously, the best teams years before had been Spirit of Amiga. Then some of those players had had a mutiny against Crash Shack, the in-game leader, and gone and joined a team called Level/Team 9, who'd managed to finish third at the World Cyber Games at the end of 2003, winning the bronze medal. So, you know, a pretty solid squad overall. Those players, those teams are starting to fall away. None of the players from the past great Danish teams, such as the ones I mentioned, except a player called SPX, formerly Sphinxy, who'd played in Level/Team 9 and at one point in time in a team called IDDQD, who'd finished top 6 at CPL Oslo in late 2002. Aside from him, and he didn't even join the Titans initially at the beginning of this run, all the players in the Titans, all their core players, were new players to the top scenes. It was also an entirely new roster rising up through the ranks, not young players or talented players joining an established roster and proving themselves. So this team was able that year to win a major. They won ESWC. They could have done even more, though, that year, because with their main lineup, with a roster change, they managed to come second at another major, the World Cyber Games, behind Team 3D. Then you had the real Tease, which was at the two CPL majors, CPL Summer and CPL Winter. Due to Wimp being underage, I think he was like 15 years old at this time, you had to be 16 to play there, even with a parent's note. They couldn't take their best player to those CPLs, and yet at those CPLs, they still managed to finish 6th place in both occasions. So still a top finish. But what more could they have accomplished with their real lineup? They had numerous close games there. They were arguably the team of 2004 when you aggregate their performances over the majors. They won a major, they had second place at another major, and at all 4 majors combined, they were top 6 as all of them as a minimum. You look at the other squads in 2004, okay, you had Eyeballers, managed to win CPL Summer a major, but nothing at ESWC. At the next CPL, they finished second, but with a different lineup, with a couple of different players and losing one of their star players. So that one doesn't really engender them being the best team. NOA bombed out at the ESWC and at the first CPL, but then they managed to win the last CPL of the year, but obviously couldn't go to World Cyber Games due to being a mixed nationality roster. SK Gaming finished second at CPL Summer, didn't accomplish anything of note at ESWC, didn't manage to even win a medal at the World Cyber Games, shockingly. And then at CPL Winter, they weren't in attendance due to a contract dispute with their team and eventually left. So again, can't really count them. So really, there aren't any other teams that you could say were ahead of this squad. They also, the Titans, introduced the world to Wimp, a guy who at the time was a fabulous talent, would later on become a key in the MTW team, which is the team of 2008, the first Danish lineup to be a true, undisputed world number 1. But that's the thing about this Titans team. They could have been so much more. Even the squad with some of their players afterwards, SK Gaming, SK Denmark, suggested they could have accomplished more if they could have stayed together, if they could have kept those teams, if they could have played for a few years more, but they were so short-lived with their best rosters and had roster problems the whole time. So as I said, they'd had a team in 2003 where they'd had Wimp and Eugene who'd come over from the team Game Reactor, but at the time the top team wasn't the Titans. It was Level, later on sponsored by Team 9, the cafe from Sweden, so Team 9 Denmark, who finished third at the World Cyber Games. So in 2003, they had Eraz, they had Eugene, they had Wimp. These were all players that would come in 2004, but they were having to use Arjon because Wimp was too young for ESWC. After ESWC, Concat, aka later on known as KK, joined up with the team. They managed to finish top 16 at CPL Copenhagen, where they had to use a couple of stand-ins again due to Wimp's age. Not such a great performance overall, but notably at that tournament, the shock of that tournament was another Danish team called Gatekeepers, who finished 4th place ahead of numerous bigger names, bigger teams, and that team featured a player called Drali, the Orpa, who later on would come on to be a key member of this Titan squad. So in 2004, one of the first notable lands was a Swedish land called Rendezvous 11. This was a tournament famous mainly throughout history for having a lot of Swedish mixed teams with top players but playing with a bunch of their friends or people they knew and their brothers, etc., and people they played with in gathers. But this tournament actually had a number of proper clans, proper teams attend it. So the Titans went there and they finished 2nd place, losing out to Eyeballers, a team that would later go on to win CPL Summer and already from the end of the previous year had some top finishes. Second, they were called Game Point or Team AMD at certain points at that point in time, or Frontline, and they were, yes, Frontline, not a Game Point, I think, and they were able to finish second at that tournament, and then they themselves finished like top 6 at the CPL. So this team the Titans had here was Drali, Eugene, Eraz, KK, and Wimp. These were the 5 players. They managed to beat out Khan and DSN's Gamers.new In the upper bracket final, they lost in very close fashion to Eyeballers, who admittedly were using Kalipo, long-time Swedish semi-pro player, as a replacement for Vilden, one of their star players in their AWPers. In the grand final, Titans managed to win one game 16-14, but then lost 6-16 to lose the tournament. Eyeballers were considered an elite team at this point in time, expected to win. So coming into ESWC, that was a solid performance, but still no indications that the Titans are going to be amazing. Now they go to ESWC with the exact same lineup, and they easily move past the first group stage, not playing any particularly great teams, just smashing them all easily. The second group stage at ESWC, they beat Astralis, the Finnish team who'd surprisingly qualified, actually beating out Destination Skyline, at the time the best Finnish team. They beat them 13-9. They beat Adrenaline, which Westerlund wasn't playing for, but this team still had some very elite players. It had Executor, it had Notorious, legendary player, it had Lucchese, Quick, a bunch of really talented top players. Team that with a slightly different core had come top 4 at the previous CPL Winter. The previous year had won ESWC, had won Click Arena, had come second at CPL Summer. So a very tenured team, admittedly with a roster move. They beat them easily 13-4, and then they beat the Czech Republic team, Cyber team 13-9 to get to the playoffs. Now in the playoffs, they played against Mouse Sports, still a decent enough squad, one of Germany's top teams. They beat them 13-5 in the quarterfinals. In the semi-finals, they shockingly played Virtus.pro, the Russian team, who'd never done anything before historically, but had managed to upset SK Sweden of Heaton and Potty, beating them 13-6. Made it to the final. In the final, they played another surprise team, the Swedish team Spixel, who at the time had risen through the ranks. They'd already had some good performances at the Swedish ESWC qualifier and some Swedish lands, showing that they were a really talented team, beating out the likes of Adrenaline. This was a very close final. It was 13-11, and the Titans won the major. They won ESWC, and obviously, as a result, people had big expectations. But the problem is, less than a month later, they went to CPL Summer, the next major of the year, and they could not use Wimp, their best player, due to age restrictions. So they took in SPX, formerly known as Finksy, who'd been playing in Team 9 previously, initially as a stand-in just to replace Wimp. So they went with the same lineup from ESWC, but SPX instead of Wimp. Now, at this tournament, they managed to move through fairly easily to the upper, I think it was the upper quarterfinals, where they beat Destination Skyline, the top Finnish team, who later on would come fourth at this tournament. They beat them in overtime on Train. They then played against SK Sweden, who at this point in time, Element had already left, the in-game leader, star Norwegian player, to go and play in NOA. And so this wasn't the SK Sweden that had been near undefeated for most of 2003, had won 3 of the majors in 2003 and numerous tournaments. This was a slightly weakened one, but still had Heaton and Potty, some truly great players in it. They lost in overtime on Mill, which was mainly an American map at the time. So down to the lower bracket they go. In the lower bracket, they immediately lost to Rival, 9-13 on Nuke. Now, this was the first time Rival, a North American squad, had ever done anything notable on LAN. They were actually famous for being very good online. They were a West Coast team filled with players who played in SoCal LANs, but they had a history of failing CPLs, never getting top finishes. And at the previous CPL, with a slightly different roster, that Rival squad had finished tied for 25th place. Instead, Rival beat them here, would go on to finish 3rd at this LAN. So they lost out here, which meant that the last match to be played was the 5th place decider. They played another West Coast SoCal team of players who'd never done anything on LAN. It was Death is Eternal, aka Die, and they lost to them on Fire, another North American map that wasn't played in Europe, 6-13 to finish in 6th place. Now, with WCG not having the same age restrictions as the CPL, bizarrely, since this WCG took place on North American soil in San Francisco, I believe, they were able to use Wimp, their best player, their young star, in the actual lineup for this tournament. But interestingly enough, Iraz, one of the older members of the team, one of the not-so-great members of the team, was removed from the lineup, and instead they used SPX, who'd proven himself at the CPL as a skilled player, he was a good all-rounder, and they put him in the lineup to make a new lineup where it was Drali, EG, KK, and Wimp who'd won ESWC, and now it was SPX who'd stood in at the CPL. So at this tournament, easily moved through the group stage. Easily won their round of 16 match over a team that you don't even need to mention. In the round of 8, they played against MIBR from Brazil. So we're talking about fabulous players already. They lost on Train, but then they managed to win a close game on Inferno and a close game on a decider of Aztec, which bizarrely was in the pool, but these were best of threes, one of the first tournaments WCG to be using best of 3 format and to be using pick ban format where you pick them up when you're a player. So playing Aztec was kind of a weird map for them to pick, but they ended up using it as the decider. Then in the semi-finals, they played against Maven. Now, Maven was the squad from South Korea, with a core of which most of the players would later go on to be known as Lunatic High, where they would place top 8 at ESWC the next year. They would finish second at CPL Winter, a major the next year behind SK Sweden. So they went on to be a fabulously talented squad. At this tournament, in the third place bronze medal game, they actually beat SK Sweden and denied Heaton and Potty another WCG medal. So they beat them here. 13-4 on Aztec, which they actually were able to play immediately. They then lost a very close 11-13 game, because it was Max Ron's 13 back, Baxter was 12 back then. They lost a 13-11 game on Train, and then they won 13-6 on Dust 2 to make the final. In the final, they played against Team 3D from North America, K-Sharp, Rambo, those guys. They lost on Train 4-13 quite heavily. They lost on, which is a map that they've been losing all tournament long. And then they lost an overtime game, very close. I think it was double or triple overtime on Cobblestone. And therefore they won the silver medal and Team 3D won the gold. Now, Team 3D that year hadn't been very good. They hadn't placed any of the big majors. And this tournament, funnily enough, was played in Condition 0, which is very similar to 1.6, but had some differences, like the models of the players looked different. Some of the maps, I think, were slightly different. And also grenades didn't do damage through walls in the same way that they did in 1.6. But anyway, it was basically the same game. So they finished second at another major. The last major of the year was CPL Winter. And due to Wimp's age, again, they had to use SPX as a stand-in, and Araz came back into the lineup. At this tournament, they easily beat Dead Zone, a Canadian team. They moved on and beat United 5 quite easily, one of the best NA teams at the time, 16-12 on Mill. This was the famous one of the games that had a De Beers curse, where the game was close, but then De Beers PC just turned off in like a 1v2 or something. Then you had a game where they played against Death is Eternal, the team that they had actually beaten, lost to rather, in the 5th place decider at the previous tournament. They got revenge, beat them 16-10 on Nuke. In the upper bracket semi-final, same place that they'd been to when they'd played SK at the previous major, CPL, they had played against Eyeballers, the team that would end up coming second place here. Slightly different lineup to the one that had won the previous CPL. This one had Valle and Bullen, and was something of a Swedish super team. They got smashed 16-2 on Dust 2 this game. In the lower bracket, yet again, same pattern repeated. They immediately lost, this time to Big Rip, another team that hadn't done a whole lot with this particular lineup. They'd had a previous core that had managed to come, that hadn't done a whole lot yet. But this was the time where they had Khan and DSN came into the lineup. Kalipo, the player who'd stood in for Eyeballers at that rendezvous early in the year. This team went on a heater. I think they finished 4th place at this tournament. They won 16-6 on Nuke. The Titans then had to play another 5th place decider. 5th place deciders were always played on Mill or Fire, bad maps for Europeans. But they played against Complexity, North American team who were on the rise, and they lost 16-7 on Mill to come 6th place at yet another major. Now, interestingly enough, early next year, the players would start to leave the team. Wimp, the star player, left the team. Later went on to go and form a squad for SK Denmark. KK left the team. He went to a team called All the Rage later. SPX Calc, who joined formerly of Team 9/Level, Eugene and Drali, all left. All eventually went to SK.dk, where they formed with Wimp again. And this team would, with a similar lineup, except Calc instead of Iraz or Iraz or who? Let me think. Or KK, finished second at the Samsung European Championship behind Pentagram. With a slightly different lineup, they bombed out at 2 CPL stops, CPL Spain, CPL Barcelona. At ESWC, they finished second, losing to Complexity, who at this point had added Sunman and really risen up to become the best team in the world after this tournament. At that tournament, they were using Zonic as a stand-in instead of, I think it was instead of Calc. I think they'd replaced him. So actually, 4 out of the 5 Titans players were in the final of the next ESWC 2005 with Zonic, who later on went on to become a legendary Danish player. So sadly, age restrictions had kept Wimp out of the CPLs, 2 of the majors of the year. He was their best player, therefore how could they expect it to go further? Even without their best player, due to their tactical style, understanding of the roles and decent map pool, they'd managed to make it to the upper bracket semi-finals of both CPLs. If you make it to the upper bracket semi-final, you are guaranteed a minimum of a 6th place finish. Sadly, after making upper bracket semis, they both times lost the semi, the lower match, and the 5th place decider to come 6th place, the worst possible finish on both occasions. Now, in this team, they had Wimp, superstar player at a young age, a prodigy of Counter-Strike. They had SPX, really talented all-rounder. They had KK, who I believe was not only AWPing, was pretty good at that, but he was also the in-game leader. They had Zonic, who later came along, stood in the next year, who transitioned from a star player, eventually would become known as a fill player, playing for NTW and NOA in later years, one of the best players. Sadly, Wimp got disillusioned. He ended up leaving this SK.dk squad, which had the spirit of the Titans continuing. Later on, he would go years later at the first IEM, Intel Extreme Masters in 2007. He finished 2nd place behind the Poles of Neon Taz. He was in H2K at the time. Then years later, he would join up with Zonic again in MTW Denmark for 2008 when they were the team of the year. I think they won 5 tournaments. They won WCG, making good on what Wimp had been able to do in 2004. They were the best team of that year, and Denmark finally had an undisputed world #1. But what could they have done in the meantime if this core could have stayed together? Even with more of an erratic core, they made another ESWC final. So much could have been done in 2006, 2007. Instead, it was a different core of Zonic, and later bringing in Ave and Sunder, and playing at certain points in time in 2006 with HPX, who would have to rebuild the legacy of Denmark as an elite Counter-Strike nation. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Eddie Wingfors, Daniel Yordanov, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, Kyla Harris, James Harding, Caesar, and special thanks go out to Matt Shakowski and Jerky's Minion in particular. Want teasers for my upcoming content? How about asking me a question for my monthly AMA? Do you want to take part in a discussion about esports with me? How about suggesting a topic or a guest for my content? Put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today.